The audio content presented here dates back to the inception of my podcasting journey, spanning up to over a decade ago. Please note that the views expressed in this content reflect an earlier version of myself. As my perspectives have evolved over time, so have I. Listeners are encouraged to approach this material with awareness of its historical context. And now, on to what you've been waiting to hear.
Welcome to another episode of Mormon Discussion. I am your host, Bill Reel. I'm grateful to have you with us today. You can reach me by email at realmormon@gmail.com. That's REELMORMON@gmail.com. You can find this podcast on iTunes, but you're only going to find the most recent 20 or so episodes. So please check out the podcast at its host site, mormondiscussion.podbean.com. That's Mormon Discussion, all one word, .podbean.com. You can also find us on Facebook under the name Mormon Discussion, all one word. Now to what you've been waiting to hear. Jeff Lindsay, welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing really well.
Good. I know most of my listeners will know who you are, but just to maybe share a little bit of background, Jeff Lindsay is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And also, Jeff, why don't you start us off by maybe giving us a brief bio of yourself and telling us a little bit about the site that you have up on the internet that would help members in defending their faith and being more aware of how to reconcile difficult issues.
Sure. My name's Jeff Lindsay. I live in Shanghai, China. I've been there for 3 years now. Before that, I was living in Wisconsin for about the past 20 or so years. Originally from the West, born in Utah, grew up in Utah, Idaho, Oregon, and have 4 boys. I went to BYU in chemical engineering, have a Ph.D. in chemical engineering from BYU, and heavily involved in intellectual property, now working to guide the intellectual property of a large Asian company. Very fascinating experience in Shanghai. Served a mission in Switzerland, German-speaking Switzerland, way back when, and had a great experience there. It was after my mission that I got involved in the whole field of LDS apologetics, or some of the intellectual aspects of being a Latter-day Saint. My interest in that, I think, was kindled when I accidentally found myself as a newlywed in the Provo 9th Ward at BYU, which was the same ward that Hugh Nibley attended, and got to meet him. In fact, I was asked to help relieve his gospel doctrine teaching duties by splitting things up, sort of being a team teacher or alternating weeks with him. And that led to some interaction and becoming really fascinated with what he was doing. And that led to just a lot of, reading, a lot of interest over the years, and ultimately led to me putting some of my thoughts and experiences down into web pages in the early 90s that led to what I'm doing today. So I've got a few things out there on the web now, and trying to be part of this community of people that are interested in both defending the church and helping people to better understand the richness of the Latter-day Saint experience.
To be asked to essentially relieve Hugh Nibley of some of the teaching in the class, that had to be pretty daunting.
No, it was just simply a matter of there was someone there willing to do it, because he was at the time preparing a lot of his books. It was very demanding on him physically, and they needed someone. He wanted to teach gospel doctrine, but he didn't want to have to do it every week. So it was just finding someone to switch weeks with him. It was not like they needed some great scholar to be up there and continue his type of teaching. He was a fascinating teacher, though. I remember one Sunday he got up and started teaching a 1-hour lecture, full speed, high speed, on the Wadjet Eye, and he had hundreds of quotes. So he started talking about the Wadjet Eye, a facsimile to blah 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 blah, reading quote after quote after quote after quote. It was intense, but two old ladies, two sweet women in front of me turned to each other and said, What is he talking about? What is the Wadjet Eye or the Wedget Eye?" he never stopped to explain this figure on facsimile 2 is what I'm referring to. He assumed everybody in the audience, of course, knew all about this ancient I symbol from Egypt that means unity and everything else. And he was going into the deep, profound meanings of how it links to the priesthood. It was really interesting. So that was the kind of thing that could happen. And I learned a lot from him, but I also learned that you can't always just dump the high-level information on people and expect it to do any good.
This wasn't the Gospel Essentials class for investigators, was it?
It could have been, but it was gospel doctrine. And,
okay.
And unfortunately, I made plenty of mistakes too as a gospel doctrine teacher, and sometimes getting things that were too speculative, and there were a lot of painful learning experiences over the years. There always will be in life.
Yep, absolutely. So where can people find your website, Jeff?
Yeah, so I've got a couple of different things. I blog at Mormanity. They can go to mormanity.org, but really it's mormanity.blogspot.com. My main site is at my name, jefflindsay.com, and there's an area /LDS FAQ for frequently asked questions. Or if you Google LDS FAQ, I'm usually in the top few. So I've got, I also blog for the Nauvoo Times at nauvootimes.com, one of the team there that participating in this really interesting forum that Orson Scott Card has put together with a number of LDS writers, and that's pretty fun. So those are the main areas. jefflindsay.com, especially /LDS FAQ, and also the mormanity.blogspot.com website.
Excellent, excellent. I want to share for my listeners maybe just a little personal history. You don't know me very well, but I know you well only because I joined the church in late 1990s as a high schooler, a senior in high school. And when I joined the church, on my way to taking the discussions and preparing for baptism, I came across Fawn Brody's No Man Knows My History. And that crushed me. I mean, I was taken to this point where I thought, oh my goodness, everything the missionaries have told me, they've been dishonest with me, and nobody told me the real story. And so I spent some time doing some research. And of course, at that time, right, late 90s, there's really very little online. The computer still makes lots of noise when it signs you on and tells you you've got mail. And so there's not a lot there, but there were two things that I did find that I, to this day, am extremely grateful for. And one was your site. The other, I don't know if you remember this, but there was Book of Mormon Answer Man on the New Jerusalem site. Yep. And so those two sites, yours and his, were a huge resource to me. And I was able, as I plugged through that book, to essentially find the major points of conflict with your site and with the Book of Mormon Answer Man, and get at least answers to my questions enough to satisfy me that I could move on with faith in the gospel. And so from me to you, I've wanted to have you on for a long time, and for the biggest reason is just to say thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. That's the experience many people have, that we run into these roadblocks or things that really catch us off guard that can be barriers to faith. And sometimes the key to moving on is not having every point and every particle of that barrier, obliterated with clear-cut, peer-reviewed scientific arguments, but sometimes it's knowing that there are at least some answers, and that it's not the impenetrable barrier that we thought it is, but maybe just a bump that we can step over with a little faith. So many times what people need is just to realize that there are at least some answers out there. Not every argument has good, clear-cut answers. Not every issue and challenge to faith is something we can, blow away and say that's in the past. And there are plenty of things where we are still in a point of, uncertainty. There's confusion. There are problems that we have to grapple with at different levels. But to know that there are a lot of good answers for some of the questions that are thrown out there, and sometimes things that were points of serious weakness 50, 60 years ago have now become points of strength in terms of the intellectual arguments for the Book of Mormon or whatever. It's good for people to know that there are answers or places to look to get more information that maybe the missionaries aren't able to provide because they haven't had the exposure or the experience. Just knowing that there's some of that information out there has helped many people get past the what was a barrier to progress and move forward, and to let faith step in. There's a combination of intellect and faith going on in the conversion story for most people, I think.
Yeah, and I don't mean this to sound like a negative, but maybe just to kind of expand on that for a moment. It feels like sometimes within the church, culturally, we teach things in a very simple way. And often if we dig down, so for instance, Thomas Marsh, we'll say Thomas Marsh leftover milk strippings. And that sounds really good on the surface when you're a new member of the church who doesn't dig deeply into Mormonism. But like that story, and there's hundreds of them, we often teach things in a simple way. And when we encounter the deeper, complex view of Mormonism, those things no longer fit nice and clean. And I think sites like yours, what they offer, and this is kind of part of the reason for the podcast too that I do, is to help people see that, okay, you're right. We sometimes teach things in a simple way, and in reality that may not hold up if we dig a little deeper. But there's still other ways to think about these issues, even within this complexity, that can allow for us to see that while maybe on the surface there's a church leader who teaches a certain view and most members might accept that as doctrine, in reality there might be a difference of opinion between lots of church leaders on that issue, and allow people the room to say, okay, I don't have to, swallow this gigantic pill. There's other ways that I can look at things.
That's a great way to put it. There are other ways of looking at things, and so many times, we see through a glass darkly, or look into a mirror that can be give a poor reflection of reality. Thinking about the way Paul described things, we have such a tiny understanding of what is there, and as new information comes out, we need new ways of looking at things. We have to challenge some of the old assumptions that we make. And it's so easy in the church for things to be taught at a very simple level because our understanding is, at any point, very simple. There's a good chance that many things that we think we know right now about science and matter will seem ridiculously simple and out of date 20 years from now. And we have to update our understanding of the universe, our understanding of how things work. And it's the same with the gospel. We have some core pieces that we can know are true. The Spirit can help people understand are true. God lives. Jesus is the Christ. Sins can be forgiven. There has been a restoration of authority. But the details that many times we think we know, and we spew out this piece of information, the things are often more complicated, and we have to sometimes dig in and re-understand what things really mean. I mean, a good example is the creation. For centuries, Christians assumed that 6 days, 6 24-hour days, that's how it was done. Earth is, now 4,000 or 5,000 years old, and it was done in these 6 24-hour periods. But as we find out that the geologic record does not really accommodate that, and it looks like the Earth really is much, much older. At that point, we can realize, oh, wait a second, this Hebrew word yom that we translate as day doesn't require it to be a 24-hour day. It can be a much longer period. It can be some unspecified time or era or epoch. Once we step back and update our assumptions and our interpretation of the text, we can realize we can still, generally accept the creation story if we understand it with, the proper filters and assumptions built in, and not get too literal in some of our approaches.
Yeah, and you raise a good point there. I know you've written about this before, but I did an episode a while back about the room that leaders, general authorities within the church have given us to even take lots of the aspects of the creation or even the fall as figurative. And we often don't think we have that room unless we dig deeper. And so it kind of reminds me of something I've stated before, I know others have talked about, which is for those Latter-day Saints who kind of dig beyond the surface level, problems are encountered. Conflict, or what they perceive as conflicting information, is encountered. But what I find happens generally is if one keeps digging, one keeps trying to get to the bottom of what the source says, what are the multitude of opinions on that issue, what is the actual official doctrine of the church. Often if one continues to dig, rather than continue to lose faith, there all of a sudden kind of hits this moment where you start to rise back up and there's a place where faith can become a viable option on the table again.
And I think that parallels the experience of many people. When we have these crises of faith, when some issue really bothers us, I think a wise approach is, as President Holland has said, cling on to what you have and press forward. Do the best you can with what you've got, focus on what you know, and then be patient and keep digging. My own experience has been similar. I had a crisis of faith back during the time when I was serving as a bishop in Wisconsin over some of the Book of Abraham issues. And the presentation of information by some of the professional anti-Mormons and critics that go after the church was extremely persuasive. It looked like, wow, slam dunk case. Something has really, really gone wrong here. And I went to the Lord in prayer and said, my experience with the Book of Mormon, the things I've learned and had with the experience with the Book of Mormon have just convinced me that this really is a legitimate book, real scripture. But what went wrong with the Book of Abraham? And is this a fraud? Did Joseph fall? And so forth. And I was really, really troubled by that. And I just felt very strongly, just wait. Don't fall to pieces yet over this and dig in. And so I thought, okay, I will put this on hold and I will study and learn and try to understand this better. Picked up a book by H. Donald Peterson on kind of the history behind the Book of Abraham. And very quickly found out that some of the issues involving the scrolls and their nature, the number of scrolls and the quantity and so forth, directly challenged or gave room to cope with some of the attacks. And in fact, noticed that the attacks, at least in that day, I think they've become more sophisticated since then, but some of the attacks that the Tanners had and others had published at this stage in the 90s just completely obfuscated the fact that there were multiple scrolls, a larger collection of records, and that what was found in the New York Museum, the Metropolitan Museum, was certainly a subset of the larger collection of scrolls that existed, and that there were other documents that were sold to Missouri and ended up in the Chicago fire and so forth. Well, the slam dunk argument that now we have the records that Joseph Smith had and that we don't have anything to do with Abraham was certainly quite a different argument once you realize that there were, yes, definitely other records that are not part of the current collection. I realized that, I felt to some degree that the wool had been pulled over my eyes by the anti-Mormon arguments, and that made me realize I need to be much more cautious in taking some of the critical arguments against the church at face value and to recognize there may be more to the story and definitely other ways of looking at things. And since then, some of the things that have come out in favor of the Book of Abraham, some of the information we have about the text and about ancient covenant patterns and so forth, has made the Book of Abraham, instead of being the soft spot or the weak underbelly of Mormonism, is really an area that we can celebrate and find a lot of exciting confirmation of authentic ancient character. There's a much more vibrant debate now on the Book of Abraham than there was in the past, and a lot of exciting evidence coming out. And the point is, maintain faith. We're always going to need some degree of faith. There are always going to be arguments that are going to look convincing without faith. But if we have faith and press forward, dig in and study, we don't have to turn off our brains. We don't have to just rely on faith alone. There are a large number of very intellectually satisfying areas that we can use to supplement and strengthen our testimonies and get a lot of intellectual satisfaction as Latter-day Saints.
That's beautiful. I wanted to ask you the question of why you got into apologetics, and I realize you answered that a little bit at the beginning, but for most people who jump into this area, it becomes something personal first before they do that. And so was it this time when you were serving as a bishop, this Book of Abraham issue, or were there other things that were going on at the time that you decided to start the site and jump in?
I had actually started my site before that particular crisis of faith. It was about 1993 1994 2004, actually, when I joined. I had just come to Wisconsin. I just joined Kimberly-Clark Corporation in R&D, and was introduced to the internet then. And it was I began to realize that the internet is going to be the way of the future, with the vast amounts of information that people can share. And I was quite excited by that. And one of the first things I did was go online and search for information about the church. And I was trying to find out, okay, what is the church's website like? And to my surprise, the church didn't have a website at the time. And they were working on it, but there wasn't a nice LDS.org place that people could go to. And in fact, about the only information I could find on the church were a list of problems with Mormonism on the internet. And I thought, well, this is ridiculous. The church doesn't have a website up, and there's this is the very early days of the internet, of course. And all that's out there is this hostile information. Well, somebody's got to do something about that. So I thought I'd better put something up. So I will apologize in advance. My website is very amateurish, poor design, working on improving it. It's a challenge, but I'm actually in the process of making it more WordPress-based as opposed to all the clumsy hand coding that I've done traditionally. But I started this very amateur web page to at least put some information out there, basics of the church. Here are basic things we believe. Here's some basic issues. And I thought, well, all the stuff I've been reading from Hugh Nibley and others is really interesting. We ought to at least put some references out there so people can know that there are these excellent books and resources. So I felt like there was an absence of information. Somebody had to do something. So, well, why not jump in and put a few things out there? And at the same time, I was really interested and I'm very proud of my hometown, or the town then that I lived in, Appleton, Wisconsin, and put some information up about Appleton and just a few other areas where I had personal interest and hobbies. I just said, hey, this is easy. I can create a web page, put information that's important to me and share it, and eventually realized that by having a lot of content, it made it more visible or helpful in Google, and people were linking back, and that was good. So I started it because there was an absence of information, felt a need to do something, a need to share. I enjoyed writing. And, it's just been, a few hours a week, but over the years it accumulates. And also realized that having a site that's been there for a while and has different content, different places, can help people in their searching. So even though now there are much better sites than mine and much better information in many areas, the Maxwell Institute's got just loads of material, and the Mormon Interpreter and Fair LDS and so forth. Even though there's a lot of great information out there now where I like to send people, and there's still a need to have the different flavor and personality and structure that I've got, just because the more that's out there, the higher the chances are that someone will stumble upon it, or that it might show up in a particular search. So I keep it there. I'm not planning on taking it down, and I'm trying to update and make it better. But I don't have any intentions of being any more significant or more valuable than the very excellent resources that are out there, especially LDS.org. But it's a way of capturing some of the searches people do and providing information that they might be helpful to them at various stages.
Yeah, I agree, and I love your site, and recognize that even the other sites you speak of at times will refer people back to your site for the information you've gotten. So I would second that I hope your site is up for a long time. I want to ask you two more questions to kind of maybe work towards wrapping up. And the first one is, Elder Marlon Jensen made the comment that we're experiencing within the church right now, and he said he would use the term apostasy, the likes of which we've not seen since Kirtland. And I realize that we're in the internet age, and that's part of the issue. But is there differences between what you were doing 20 years ago when you started your site versus the way in which you have to defend the church today?
Yeah, I think so. I think the easy availability of information and social media especially makes it much easier for people to get exposed to hostile information, but also be almost conditioned to have a a popular mindset that takes the things of religion and faith in a very sarcastic, almost smarmy, flippant way that makes it hard for people to really take Latter-day Saint faith seriously, or any kind of faith seriously. And this comes back, cycles around, and influences the attitudes and assumptions people within the church sometimes take to hostile issues. So it's very, very easy for people to, with kind of the mindset that is so abundant on the internet now, it is very difficult for people to look at some of the arguments against the church and take the faithful approach that, well, maybe there's another way of looking at this. Maybe this is not all the information. It's just so easy to take the kind of the negative, almost mob mentality or herd mentality that, well, of course, these old guys running the church in Salt Lake, of course they're a bunch of old, insert whatever negative adjectives you want. So there's a greater cynicism that is inspired, I think, by the almost the herd mentality of social media. Social media is a great tool. It can convey lots of information, but it also makes the peer pressure much stronger and I think more effective than in the past. And so you can have all sorts of websites, all sorts of influencers kind of joining in on the same wavelength of skepticism and hostility, especially on social issues that can be painted in a very emotional way. And the result is we have people being much more influenced by, being very heavily influenced by emotion that's coming from peer influence and the way things are painted and colored in the marketing techniques of the adversary and of media. They're being very influenced by strong emotional input while thinking that it is purely objective and rational, and not understanding the emotional hooks that have been set in them, pulling them one way or the other. And this is a real challenge, that we have a large number of people that feel like they're on the kind of the cutting edge of being intellectual and objective and honest, and not fully understanding how much emotion is playing in their thinking, and how much the marketing of others is guiding and shaping the argument. And so this becomes a real challenge. We have this combination of an abundance of information that appears to be objective and intellectual and factual, and very powerful social peer influencing tools that shape things emotionally, shape the assumptions that are used when people approach these things. And that makes the battle quite different. It's not just responding to the arguments like, well, how could Joseph Smith carry the gold plates from the Hill Cumorah, because that much gold would have weighed 200 pounds. How could he have possibly done that? It's not just somebody coming back and saying, well, look, here's the metal, here's the alloy, and it was probably really 50 or 60 pounds, and that's entirely doable. The arguments now are much more shaped by emotion, in the sense of, oh, it's a big corporation, this is a cover-up, these are white men, this is unjust homophobia, all these issues that can become very emotional that now shape the argument. And so we have to engage people in a broader sense. We can't just throw out the intellectual arguments and the list of responses. We have to also recognize there is a very significant emotional issue as well, and help people not only understand with their minds these issues, but feel with their hearts the reality and the compassion and the love and the joy that Latter-day Saint experience brings. And this gets back to basic testimony. Testimony in Latter-day Saint in our church, in our gospel, is not just the warm violin music playing and the soft, fuzzy feeling in the heart. The scriptures are really clear that the Lord will reveal to us in our heart and our mind, as it says in Doctrine and Covenants 8, and that we have to study things out in our mind. And there's this combination of knowledge and spirit working together in our testimonies. We have to also use that in our response to the anti-testimony material that is out there. Help people know, not just with their minds, but also with their hearts, that there is something more. There's another way of looking at things, and there are, in fact, rich, positive, very fulfilling aspects to the Latter-day Saint faith that we can't convey just with static, stale responses that are purely intellectual alone. We've got to help them feel the Spirit, feel the joy, feel the love that is part of the gospel, and that is the real challenge.
I love that, especially that whole idea, which is that the critics are using emotion to take us away, and so certainly the solution from the faithful has to involve an emotional component as well. I like that. I wanted to ask you, I know on your site you spend some time with chiasmus, and I find that to be an evidence of the gospel, and this is the only issue I want to talk about, and then we'll give you kind of a wrap-up question. So I know that the critics, when they talk about this proposed evidence of the gospel, they'll talk about how easy this is to do, that if one were to open a book of nursery rhymes, one would find it. And for some reason, I don't find their argument to be compelling because of the extent at which this poetic form is used throughout the scriptures, and especially in the Book of Mormon. Your thoughts on chiasmus and what the critics have kind of, I guess, tried to move the ball by trying to tackle that proposed evidence and kind of diminish it?
And most of the efforts the critics make to attack issues in Latter-day Saint faith serve useful purpose. And I want to point out that these discussions are important, and it's valuable to look at things and understand strengths and weaknesses of positions, of our positions. And they have made some valid points here that help us better appreciate and understand chiasmus and Hebraic literature and its role and influence. Yes, you can get chiasmus accidentally. You can sometimes, when you have a dense series of terms in a few paragraphs, find actually some fairly nice examples of chiasmus. And this is important to understand, that it can happen. It does occur in text occasionally, and if you search enough, go through enough books, you're going to find a few gems here and there. The issue of how to tell a actual Semitic text from a random text is a complicated issue, and there are quite a few factors in addition to chiasmus that we could talk about and consider. But in terms of chiasmus alone, I would argue that the density of chiasmus and the sophistication, the evidence of this was sculpted, this was done as to create art, it's related to the issue in the arts of when is something a sculpture or a work of art, and when is this a piece of accidental graffiti or rust, or a few rocks fell on top of each other. Sometimes in modern art, honestly, for me, it's hard to tell when something is an accident and when it is art. But there are times when you look at a painting or a sculpture and you realize, and we were just in Italy a couple of months ago, and the just overwhelming sense of artistic depth that you can find in say, the Uffizi Museum in Florence. Just these majestic sculptures, or standing before Michelangelo's works. When you realize this is no accident, this was sculpted, this was done by a master's hand. There are examples in the Book of Mormon where you realize that this chiasmus fits so perfectly with the overall message that is being pursued here, that the structure is deliberate, it's intentional. This is not just 5 or 6 random words, that there is art there. And so it is somewhat, you can always argue whether this is art or accident is a subjective issue, but when you're standing before one of the marble statues of Michelangelo, you realize this was a master's hand. And I think it's the same way. I think Alma 36, I think other passages in the Book of Mormon convey that. And when you find things like a Hebrew word plays, subtle Hebrew word plays, suddenly opening up new avenues of meaning in a passage, then that also gets really exciting. The Book of Mormon is so loaded with Hebraisms and structures that were just not understood in Joseph Smith's day, at least certainly not widely, almost certainly not by him. And to find them now even today, in the last couple of years, new ones are coming out that add whole new layers of understanding to certain parts of the Book of Mormon that just suggest this really is an ancient Semitic work. Chiasmus is an important part of that, but it's maybe not even the most impressive. There are many aspects that point to the Book of Mormon as this is a legitimate ancient text. We need to take it seriously.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And Alma 36 is the one that I always was drawn to as I was reading about some of those proposed evidences of the church, and I look at that from the beginning of the chapter to the end of the chapter, and it just, I'm just sharing my 2 cents, but the statistical likelihood of that being an accident just seems so improbable that I don't, for me anyway, have any other choice than to see that as an intended implementation in the text. So thank you for that. I want to wrap up just asking you one last question, which is your thoughts of what's going on right now with the number of Latter-day Saints who are struggling, and what maybe the average member can do to be of help, and what maybe we are doing as a church that is helpful, but maybe where we can improve at.
Right. This is a really important topic, and thank you for asking this. I feel it's really important to understand that people that are having crises of faith are good people. They're our brothers and sisters, and they need our support and understanding. It is far too easy for Latter-day Saints who maybe aren't familiar with some of the issues and some of the challenges that are out there. It's far too easy to blow them off and to say, pray about it, you'll be fine, just have faith, everything will work out. That's okay for some people. A friend of mine in Shanghai who went through a crisis of faith, a really good man, told me that, not everybody is the same. A lot of people need to understand, need to have that intellectual confirmation for them to move on. And when they run into serious challenges that undermine their faith or suggest that, oh my goodness, what the missionary said was all wrong, it is not enough to just say, pray about it and you'll be fine. They need to have someone to talk to. They need to have someone that understands what they're going through. They need to know there are places to find answers. They need to be given hope that there is, in fact, a reality to the gospel of Jesus Christ that they can cling on to. So when those crises happen, take these people seriously. Give them support. And if you don't have answers, and many people don't care enough to even find the answers. If you don't have answers, at least understand there are answers. For many of the issues, there are good answers. For other issues, there are at least reasonable responses. And give them hope and help them find them. That may mean putting them in touch with someone who's familiar with the issues. That may mean helping them to go to websites, my website or Mormon Interpreter, Maxwell Institute, Fair LDS, Fair Mormon, Shields, a number of good sites out there, but helping them to find the information that they need. And also to listen to them, to just be there to talk through the issues with them, or to find someone that can. We're not going to necessarily have slam dunk arguments in response, but we can have people that can say, yes, I went through this, I had this struggle, here's how I dealt with it, here's what I concluded, here's the different way I found to look at it. They need to know they're not alone, and that their issues and their challenges are legitimate. Those are fair questions. They are, at least from their perspective, they are important enough to cause them pain. They're important enough then for us to take them seriously, and let's treat them with the love and respect they need. At the same time, there are some people, no matter what we say, no matter how good the responses are that we come up with, they may, because of their crisis of faith and the way they're approaching things, choose to go a different direction and perhaps even leave the church. When that happens, continue to love those people. Understand that they don't have a social disease because they now see things differently. All the things we liked and enjoyed about them and their company and their presence before don't suddenly change because they are no longer members. We may choose to not get in debates and talk about the religious issues very much now that we have maybe strong differences that are off topic for discussion perhaps, but continue to socialize and love and make them part of our lives. and recognize their value, and that their value as human beings does not drop to zero because they are, at least for the moment, not members of the same church. And taking them seriously, cutting them a break, recognizing that they are not evil people or people to be shunned or avoided just because they are having a crisis of faith that's taking them out of the church. Let's continue to be friends and to socialize and love and respect them and take them and their concerns as legitimate ones. We may see them differently. Hopefully we see them differently in ways that allow us to continue with our faith, but give them a break, cut them some slack, and be kind and loving to them wherever they go.
Yeah, and as you're saying that, you reminded me of an experience I had this past Sunday, that I was talking to a sister missionary who was having some deep questions. She was thinking about things in a way that most people at that age are not, and as she's asking the questions, I made this point to her, which I think is valuable to the listeners of this podcast who are having a hard time. And you mentioned this, which is, I'm not naive enough to think that on every critical question I have the strongest position as I give my response. I realize that some of the responses we give to the difficult questions may in turn be the weaker position. But there's an important point to make, which is, if one decides to fall on the other side of that fence, to choose to disbelieve and lose faith and leave the church, one is also, from that perspective, also going to have to choose on some of those issues the weaker argument. And I think once one understands that it's not clear-cut, that no matter which direction you go, you're going to have to choose to allow the other side to have the strength in some of those issues, then all of a sudden faith is a viable option back on the table again. And people can say, I've weighed the evidence. On some issues, the church has a stronger position. On other issues, the church does not. And I'm going to choose by faith, the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of which not seen, to move forward and press forward in the gospel. So I appreciate you making mention of that, because it reminded me of that experience, and I think that's an important point for listeners that you touched on. Yep. So I want to wrap up, Jeff, if you wouldn't mind pointing people just one more time to where they can find your Mormanity blog, as well as the Jeff Lindsay site.
Sure. Mormanity.blogspot.com. And usually if you just Google Mormanity, it'll bring it up. And then jefflindsay.com. And there's a big LDS section there, such as jefflindsay.com/LDS FAQ. You can do it all uppercase or lowercase for the LDS FAQ. It'll get you there either way. And then I also write for the Nauvoo Times, nauvootimes.com, which is a really interesting project from Orson Scott Card.
Awesome. Jeff, I appreciate you being on. For those who have not visited Jeff Lindsay's blog and website, they are just full of information on many of these issues that the critics like to raise. And I really appreciate all the work you've put into that site, Jeff, over the years. And speaking for myself, I know you've been a blessing to me, but I can only imagine the countless others who have been able to continue to lead with faith because of you. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you, and I really appreciate what you're doing, and you're a wonderful example, and good luck with your ongoing work.